Well, this name isn't as descriptive as the others we've covered so far. It doesn't mean, for example, that the requirements aren't supposed to function or anything to that effect. No. Rather, non-functional requirements describe qualities the system needs to have that are not explicitly functional. And for that reason, sometimes we call them quality requirements also. I'm going to stick with non-functional since that's the term most commonly used today. Non-functional requirements tend to fall under a number of categories, and I'm putting a handful of them on the screen now. Okay, so here you see a list, and this list, by the way, is a very small sample of various types of non-functional requirements. I'll quickly describe each one. Data privacy refers to the importance of organizations safeguarding their clients' and employees' personal data. Imagine, for example, that you went to work one day and found out that some system had accidentally emailed to all the employees a spreadsheet containing everyone's names and salaries. Data privacy requirements are meant to safeguard data and make sure that kind of thing doesn't happen. Disaster recovery. It's probably obvious, but these requirements typically talk about how the system is expected to respond after some kind of, disaster. If there's a power outage, is it okay for the server to go down? Do we need backup power generators to keep it running? All that kind of stuff. Legal and compliance generally relate to anything from showing a copyright on a web page to listing pages and pages of regulations that the solution and organization have to comply with. It's a very important category. Security is also a critically important category. This can cover all kinds of security. And that's from how someone logs onto a system to which rooms in a facility need to be locked. It can be anything. We primarily see this category on technology projects and especially related to system security. System availability, that describes requirements for how much of the time the system needs to be up and running. 100% is not feasible. So we have to put some thought into it and specify these requirements. System performance, that deals with how long it takes for the system to perform a given task. If you've ever been online and a website is really slow, that's probably because there is some kind of performance problem with the website. And the last one that I'll mention here is usability. And that category describes how easy it should be for users to understand and, use your system. As I mentioned, there are dozens of other types of non-functional requirements. If you look on Wikipedia or in an internet search, you'll probably get lists of dozens of more categories. This really raises the question, which categories of non-functional requirements do you include in your document and on your project? I'll give you two answers to this. First, your organization may have a template already for requirements documentation. And if so, it'll probably list different types of non-functional requirements, but it won't actually list the individual requirements. That template should, at the very least, serve as a starting point. The other way is to look for, listen for them. So when Martha, the product analyst, says that a user should be able to do something in the system, you might want to ask her, hey, which user are you talking about? If it's restricted to people within the company or people with a particular system entitlement, well, that sounds like a security requirement, and that's one of our non-functional requirement categories. Non-functional requirements, I will say, are sadly the type of requirement most overlooked by the business analyst community, and that's bad. It means that we often overlook a particular type of requirement, and then our users or customers end up paying the price. You really have to pay attention to these non-functional requirements. And let's look at some examples here. Okay, we've given this requirement on the screen the ID NF1, which signifies that it's a non-functional requirement. You'll notice that the next column, category, is new to this table format. It indicates which type of non-functional requirement we're dealing with. And in this case, we have a performance requirement. The actual text of the requirements in the next column, the system will generate the report 5 or fewer seconds after the user submits the report creation request. Okay, pretty clear, pretty complete. The rationale, and this is why I chuckled earlier, is that users will perform this task many times daily, and we don't want them to go crazy waiting for it to be generated. Okay, the next column, the source of the requirement, is listed here as Martha. I'm going to come back to that in just a second. And we also have a parent requirement of business requirement BR2, which states that the system will enable a user to create summary reports of all the beverages sold monthly. Okay, this seems pretty straightforward. I hesitated for a minute just now when I said that the source of the requirement was Martha, because usually non-functional requirements are not proposed by stakeholders directly, and I kind of referred to this. In this case, I would have expected the business analyst probably to ask Martha about acceptable timeframes, and then for Martha to come up with something. But even in this scenario, even if the BA suggests that 5-second time frame, when Martha agrees, she becomes the source of the requirement. The business analyst is rarely the source of the requirement. Usually it's some other stakeholder. All right, let's look at another example of non-functional requirement. All right, okay, I've been waiting for this requirement. The ID is NF2. It's a security requirement. It says that the system will only allow entitled internal users to log on to the system. Makes sense. The rationale is that the system accesses sensitive data, so access to it must be controlled. That also makes sense. Okay. The requirement was provided by Martha Warren, and wait a minute, we don't have a parent requirement for this one. I wonder why that would be. Well, anytime that this happens, when you have a non-functional requirement or functional requirement or whatever that doesn't have an applicable parent, you have to look into why that's the case. More often than not, it means that you missed a requirement somewhere up the chain. If we take a look at the business requirements we have so far, and they're now on the screen, we can see if there's anything here that applies to security. Okay, it doesn't really look like there is one. And I frankly wouldn't expect one to be here naturally at the beginning. When our product manager, Solomon, was coming up with his list of business requirements, he was thinking about what he needed the system to do. He wasn't thinking about how fast the system needed to be or how secure it needed to be. But if you sit back down with Solomon and ask him if the system needs to be secure, or if the system needs to be fast, or the system needs to comply with regulations, he'll almost certainly say yes, right? So this is yet another caution to you as the BA to be on the lookout for requirements that the organization will need, but that people aren't really thinking about in the immediate scenario. And that goes double for non-functional requirements. All right, so how would I handle this situation? Well, there are probably a few different ways. What I personally like to do is to include a business requirement with the sponsor's buy-in. That includes system safety and soundness. That's essentially a master business requirement, which you can tie lots of non-functional requirements to, and some user and functional requirements as well. But that's just my own approach. If you come up with a better way of doing it, go for it. One more? Yeah, I think we have time for one more example. Let's go ahead and put that on the screen. Okay. Our last example here is NF3. This is a compliance requirement. It simply says that the system must act in accordance with FDA rule, blah, blah, blah. It's a regulatory obligation, okay? And the source of the requirement is the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, but it was provided to the BA by Solomon, the product manager. And it also has its parent business requirements as BR2. Okay, this is a bad requirement. Why? Well, no one knows what the rule means. And I know that for a fact because I made it up. It would actually be much better to state what the system has to do or not do to be compliant with the regulation. So why don't we fix it like this? Okay, this is a lot better. It's not perfect really because we should go into a lot more detail about what kind of information should be retained in the system record. But this is a good illustration how simply referring to a regulation or another standard isn't good enough. It needs to be translated into something actionable that implementation teams can execute on. And what's our fancy word for that? Implementable. Yeah, that's right. Okay, I think we've covered non-functional requirements. Let's go ahead and summarize. Non-functional requirements or quality requirements, they relate to organizational needs that aren't specific functionality of the system. We covered 7 different types of them, but there are undoubtedly dozens more. And super important. It is very important for you, the business analyst, to look for non-functional requirements because other stakeholders usually don't think about them. Okay, well, I think that's all for non-functional requirements. And that's also we've got for the various types of requirements. We'll now be moving on to a new topic, and that is requirement sources.